morning, church. This is Ricky, and welcome to Hope for Today. Happy Monday, everybody. It is a new week, and my Bible says that every time the sun rises, there is hope and assurance of a brand new mercy. So I bid you peace, I bid you joy, I bid you blessings from God as you launch into this new week. That said, we're going to kind of theme this week's lessons for Hope for Today. I call it the Is There Anything to Fill in the Blank for God? Is there anything to fill in the blank for God? We'll be talking about various aspects of where we may be at in our life to remind us that at the end of the day, God supersedes whatever our fill in the blank moment is for His glory and for grace extended to you. This morning on Monday, I want to beg the question, is there anything too hard for God? Is there anything too hard for God? There's this song that's a gospel number, and it goes like this. There is nothing too hard for God, nothing too hard for God. Power belongs to God. And then the altos go, there is nothing too hard. Anyways, I'm going to sing the whole song, and I need to stop. But anyways, the song says, is there anything too hard? There's nothing too hard for God, because power belongs to God. And that's all I want you to hear as you get up on this Monday. As you get up out of bed, as you start to brush your teeth and drink your coffee, go with the truth of Scripture. There is nothing too hard for God. Some of you are going through some things that seem impossible, but I just want to remind you that our God can turn possibilities out of impossibilities. There's nothing too hard for Him. Some of you are experiencing the tumult of a wayward child who does not know Jesus. And I wanted to tell you, there's nothing too hard for God. Some of you, you're at the end of the month. You're at the end of the money. But I've come to tell you, there's nothing too hard for God. Some of you or someone you know is sick right now and afflicted, fighting some serious illness. I've come to tell you there's nothing too hard for God. Some of you feel like there's no other hope for this relationship or for this marriage. There's nothing too hard for God. There's nothing too hard for God. I read Bible stories of all of God's accomplishments. There was the story of the Battle of Jericho. When there was this great walled city, and here you had this great professional, gigantic army going up against these slaves who were armed with pocket knives and pitchforks. But they shouted out to God, and the walls came tumbling down. There ain't nothing too hard for God. There's a story about the Red Sea and how Egypt and his army and Pharaoh was coming after the Israelites, and there was the Red Sea before them, and Moses stretched his hand, and they walked across as God parted the Red Sea. There are scientists who postulate that the Red Sea sometimes goes down to 3 or 4 feet at certain seasons of the year, which explains why the children of Israel were able to cross upon it. But my grandfather, with his 8th grade education, will say, well, look how powerful God is. If the Red Sea was 3 or 4 feet, God figured out a way to drown all of Pharaoh's armies in just a couple of feet of water. There ain't nothing too hard for God. So I just want to remind you to be people of faith. Be people who trust in God, because there's nothing too hard for God. Jeremiah chapter 32, verse 27, God says, the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah in verse 27, behold, I am the Lord, the God of all flesh. Is anything too hard for me? And the answer is no. There is nothing too hard for God. I've got a grandfather that I love who right now is in the intensive care unit in Jackson, Mississippi, and he's fighting COVID-19. And at the age of 88, my heart has been perplexed as to whether or not he will make it. But he would tell me, is there anything too hard for the Lord? So if he chooses to believe, I will believe as well, because there's nothing too hard for God. There was a sailor named Tony Bullimore, British sailor, one of the greatest sailors in all the world, was on the worldwide, around the world sailing competition many years ago. And the story goes that here he is sailing on his sailboat, just literally 1,000 miles from land, but he hits a violent wave and it overturns his boat. And here he is completely capsized, underneath the bottom of the boat. And the story goes that Tony Bullimore was literally floating in the ocean in the middle of nowhere with just a few feet of air between himself and the hull of the boat for 4 days. for 4 days, he asked God to rescue him. And on the 4th day, the Royal Army had used satellites to position and pinpoint where he was. And they knocked on the outside of the hull and said, "Is anyone there?" And Tony said, "I am here." And he knew then that there was nothing too hard for God. You may be capsized in your own proverbial upside down boat of a situation, but God told me to tell you that there's nothing too hard for him. Keep floating, keep fighting. There's nothing too hard for God. And that's hope for today. And I'll see you next time.